Hello, this is Geoff Ryman for The Heat on Resonance 104.4 FM in London. Go to resonance.com online or to our Mixcloud to listen to this program again. Climate change. The news isn't good. Antonio Guterres says it's inevitable that we now will overshoot the 1.5 degrees target warming. The UNFCCC says only 64 countries of the 195 signatories of the Paris Agreement have updated their domestic climate plans. Today, we're talking to writer Kim Stanley Robinson about his wonderful novel, The Ministry for the Future. It's a cautiously optimistic account of how in the near future we could dial down climate change. The novel's had impact in the real world. For example, Oxford University has created its own Ministry for the Future. Hello, Stan, and welcome.
Hey there, Geoff. It's good to talk to you.
Yeah, it's good to talk to you too. I'd just like to ask, what's it like to have something in the real world come about because of your novel?
Well, it's basically a great thing. Surprising and disorienting, but good. I've had to try to figure out the why of it and respond appropriately, because really since the book came out, which was in the fall of 2020, in the depths of the pandemic, I've done nothing since then except Ministry for the Future type activities, like this one right here. So that's unusual, and I've had to rearrange my life and understand that although I would prefer to just be a working novelist, which is really what I do and what I like to do, I have to figure out how to also be some kind of a public spokesperson for the climate crisis, which is odd but interesting.
Yeah, does that mean you've given up writing as well, or just temporarily stopped writing, and given the urgency of the situation we find ourselves in?
Well, just temporarily, and I have to say that because every hour isn't occupied by ministry business, but just every day, I have written 2 nonfiction books to sort of keep myself in the game and reassure myself that I haven't been completely thrown off track. But nonfiction, I mean, Geoff, you're a novelist and one of my favorite novelists, I have to say, and one of my teachers as a novelist. And novels are just, if you're into them, they're more absorbing, both to read and to write. So the work involved, I've kept my fingers busy, but I'm anxious to get back to fiction, and I actually have a plan. I finally have a plot, some characters, some older stories to lift and mix and remix. And so I'm ready to go this winter in starting a new novel, which I hope will look and read quite differently from Ministry for the Future, while still being about the climate crisis. So I have a plan, and I think this winter I'll get back to a more balanced life that is more focused on what I really like to do, or what I'm best at.
Yay. Well, your readers will be very grateful to hear that. Given that we're coming up to COP, perhaps you could just review for us some of the key things your characters do in the course of the novel, some of the measures they take or the activities they're involved with, because we have a measured, optimistic outcome. We kind of limit the extent of climate change in your near future.
Yes, it's a polyphonic novel that has a cast of thousands, as they would say in the movies, and many point of view characters come in and then leave. So the structure of it is unusual for me, although the novel can do anything formally, and I chose this form deliberately to spread out the actor network involved. And I did make it a best case scenario as envisioned as I was writing it in 2019. And I want to say that it holds up pretty well for a book written in 2019, in that it presents future history, the next few decades, as a mess, and an unplanned or unplannable success story where a lot of bad things happen, but a lot of good things continue to roll under the surface of the chaos. And I see that happening still 6 years later, that a lot of bad things are happening. And it is, it would be wrong to downplay how dangerous our situation is in terms of losing control of the climate and getting into a runaway greenhouse effect. That danger is very real, and a danger of a mass extinction event, which we've already begun, is very real. But the response has been international by, I'm going to estimate, millions of people who are devoting their lives and their careers to working on this issue. And so in all of the bad news, it's hard to keep track of the good news that's being done by these people of goodwill who are working on this issue. So it's still a mess. So this is a small point, but my novel still is an accurate representation even of our moment right now and our near future. So telling both parts of the story, the dangers involved of what we're doing and how slowly we're reducing fossil fuel emissions, which is really the driving factor in the crisis of higher temperatures. Well, we're going too slowly on that, but things are happening. The incredible rollout of solar power generation, as well as wind and hydro, but really the way that solar has become cheaper than new fossil fuels. Since we live and die by the profit margin, by the highest rate of return in our political economy, I mean, that's bad, but it's also true, then the fact that solar has become cheaper than fossil fuels is a crucial fact, and it's being rolled out at stupendous speed, mostly by the Chinese in terms of their manufacturing and spreading it around in their Belt and Road system. So weirdly, one has to say that one of the many climate heroes in terms of nation states, China is in many ways leading the way now. And that's not a bad thing, given that there are 1.4 billion people and have an immense productive capacity. And if they have the desire to decarbonize in order to save China itself from being poisoning, then that will help the rest of the world to do so also. So trying to tell this story in story form, in ways that people can understand, and that keeps the balance between the dangers and the hopeful opportunities and accomplishments, that's hard, and it's a daily mix of the two. And we're all living in that mix and sorting out information as we can. And everybody's got a very strong sorting mechanism that is predisposed to accept information that fits one's already existing opinion of what's going on. So one of my tasks, as I see it, is to throw new ways of seeing the situation out there, reminding people of the totality of the situation as well, and trying to keep up with the news, which is really difficult.
In the novel, I mean, one of the things, there's a wonderful sequence, makes a lot of very good use of Antarctica, and I was reminded of your novel on Antarctica. But if I understand it correctly, basically one of the things some of the people in your novel do is they put the brakes in the slide of glaciers towards the sea by removing the lubrication, which is the meltwater underneath it. They pump it up on top. That freezes it. So you, A, have less ice getting into the sea, and B, the meltwater isn't also running off. It gets refrozen. Have I got that right?
Yes, that's basically right, and I'm glad you brought it up because it's something that I'm actually involved in quite closely right now as one of my projects in the ministry orbit. There is a group called Ice Preservation that I'm part of, Ice Preservation Institute. There are quite a number of initiatives that are at this point exploratory and nonprofit, but they are soon to be supported, I think, by the UK's Great ARIA program, which is a government-funded attempt to explore these kinds of climate interventions. And the ice thing is strange because it isn't precisely climate, but it's kind of an overhang problem. Western Antarctic ice sheet is unstable because a lot of it lies on ground that is lower than sea level right now. So it easily detaches and comes off. And there are ice streams within the West Antarctic ice sheet that are moving quite fast. They're essentially glaciers with ice banks, but they're moving way faster than their banks at hundreds of meters per year, and unfortunately coming off into areas where they are floating, so the Ross Ice Shelf, the Weddell Ice Shelf, others, and those ice shelves are melting, the ice streams are going faster. The idea is this: they're running down enormous, gently tilted water slides, and it's water underneath them that is lubricating their rapid slide into the sea. And there is a natural precedent. There's one ice stream that stopped dead in its tracks about the year 1880. And the idea is this: the water underneath it was diverted elsewhere, and it thumped down onto the rock under it and came to a halt, and it's been halted ever since. It's called the Cam ice stream, K-A-M-B, after Bernard Cam, who was a glaciologist who discovered it. It used to be ice stream C. There's A, B, C. So the question that some glaciologists want to ask is, we know how to drill through the ice. It's really melting through the ice. We've done that through the ice sheets all over Antarctica. We know how to pump water. And there's not that much. Sometimes it's just a couple millimeters of water. Other times there's an under ice watershed of streams, you might say. If we were to tap into these, then the pressure of the ice itself would force the water up very near the top, 90% of the way, pump it out onto the surface where it would freeze or turn into snow. It depends on how it's dispersed. And then that ice stream might thump to a halt like the Cam. And we might be saved sea level rise. And since you're in London, I want this to be attended to. If the West Antarctic ice sheet becomes ocean, sea level rises 4 or 5 meters, which for us in America is still 20 or 25 feet. Well, this is devastating for civilization itself. So much of the world's civilization, our ports, our trade, our infrastructure at the coast, our famous coastal cities, a sea level rise that extensive, which could happen, and it would happen relatively fast on geological terms, which means, truthfully, 100 years, a couple hundred years. But our grandchildren will be around 100 years from now, and so it's pretty fast, even on historical terms. We don't want it to happen. And so this ice preservation project becomes very interesting. And I was intrigued, as you can tell, because it's a big strand of ministry for the future. People talk about geoengineering, and this is often immediately seen as a kind of an excuse to keep on burning fossil fuels, and therefore a bad thing. So geoengineering in the circles that I hang in typically would immediately equate to a bad action to try to get away with something. But now, given the carbon dioxide overshoot that we're in, as you mentioned, the Secretary General of the UN, but he's following the scientists here, we're going to push through that 1.5 degree rise in global average temperatures. That's bad. And every 1/10 of a degree we go above 1.5 is going to create more damage. And when I say that, you could just go to Jamaica today to see the kind of damage that I'm talking about.
Yeah.
I mean, that poor island is wrecked right now. And I shudder to think of what every person on Jamaica is going through right now is hard to imagine until it hits you. But in any case, these various climate interventions that are put under the blanket term geoengineering, some of them we absolutely need to do, like drawing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere at speed to get back to a more normal, a more historical balance.
One of the big aspect of the novel, because there's other things that go on, the transport system changes, airlines are forced to rethink, people go into airships. But another, I think, cornerstone of your future in the novel is the carboni, this new kind of Bitcoin. I'm not, if that's a fair description, I'm not sure I understand it. How would the carboni be different from kind of Bitcoins that we have now?
Well, I'm really sorry that I ever mentioned blockchain. Luckily, I never used the word Bitcoin, which is basically a scam, and indeed an energy-intensive scam. The only thing that really matters in this world is fiat currencies, and the rest of them are gaming systems to try to get more fiat currency, which is to say state derived or state originated currencies. And really, the benchmark on this planet up until Trump started wrecking everything was the US dollar. So everything translates to US dollars, including the carboni. So the notion in the book is simply this: that quantitative easing, which is to say the central banks making up more money from scratch, as happened in 2020 to deal with the pandemic, as happened in 2008 to try to get out of the real estate crash that began in America, quantitative easing happens, and from the strongest currencies, it about, say, $1 trillion a year could be generated year by year and given out to green causes, including and maybe focusing on carbon removal from the atmosphere. But any green cause would be worth a carboni. And so you would simply get paid to do green work by the central banks of the world, by the governments of the richest countries, like OECD countries or the G20. These are the currencies that are strong enough to inject some new money into the system and simply pay ourselves to do the necessary work. So that's the carboni, and it's not a cryptocurrency. It doesn't even need to be tokenized. It could be paid out in euros. So really, what I'm going to say here is that in ministry, I tried to tell it in a form that could be novelized so that one character and one set of banks are doing it in one method. But in the real world, it's going to be a multiplicity of methods, and the carbonia is a symbol, a literary symbol, like a kind of personification of a set of financial instruments that the financial world is gung-ho to do because they like playing with money and making money for capitalist systems. And if it happens that this also saves the biosphere as a new industry, well, fine. That's just as good a way to make money as any other. And in fact, it's a better way. Mm-hmm. So the financing for it needs to happen.
Okay. I mean, one of the things that I and I'm not no economist, and that's evident, but it seemed to me that one of the things was that you were able to trace where the money had gone, who had it, and how it had been used, which I wasn't sure if this was a measure to prevent corruption in some recipient countries, or I'm not sure what the advantage of that was.
I had it listed as a blockchain. That was a mistake, a mistake of 2019, because blockchain is cumbersome and energy intensive, and its supposed advantages of being open sourced and distributed ledger so that everybody can see it are actually not quite true in practice. So no to blockchain, but there is cryptography, and there is financial records of everything until you get into secret bank accounts or the dark pools. You have already a relatively open financial system seen from above in panopticon style by the central banks, by the World Bank, by the governments of the developed countries. They know in the largest sense where the money is. And so I don't think that this is necessarily an important component of the finance involved. In fact, the more public, the better. Oh, we got paid. And here's an example from England, the ARIA program that the UK government started, something like 10 billion pounds to be distributed. But don't quote me on the number. I may be off by a full 3 magnitudes. It may be 10 million pounds, but I think it's more than that. And this money is to be distributed to people doing climate intervention research. And that will all be publicly announced and publicly recorded. And I think that would be true of any kind of carbon reduction payouts from government sources. It'll be as open as to inspection as money ever gets.
Another feature of the book, another cornerstone, and I'm not sure it's very interestingly handled in the book, but it seems to me that there's a certain amount of violence, at least violence against property. There's out of India, which because it has this harrowingly described first chapter with a wet bulb event that kills millions of people. It's harrowingly described. And then you go on to do a really good, your character Frank May, who suffers PTSD after that. I thought that was, the PTSD was, very, very well described. And, I could feel all of that too. Because of the volte-face in Indian culture as a result of the catastrophe, something called the Children of Kali come about. And it seems to me that they're largely targeting property. Your heroine, who gets to know Frank, Mary, have I got a name? Mary McCarthy, yeah?
Murphy.
Mary Murphy. She is the head of Ministry for the Future throughout the time of the novel until her retirement. It seems to me that there's a property violence wing of the ministry itself, which they tell her deliberately don't take part and don't know anything about. Have I got that right?
Yes, that's basically right.
So the question from that, if I've got it right, because I don't want to misdescribe your novel, the question for you then is violence necessary to get what has to be done about climate change?
Well, I don't know how to answer that, and maybe the crucial word here is necessary. I don't know if it's necessary or not. Is it going to happen? Maybe. There is a thing called the Lanchester paradox after John Lanchester, very fine writer there in London, where he pointed out that there should already be a lot more climate sabotage than there is. And he's wondering why it doesn't happen, and that's the so-called Lanchester paradox. In my novel, it begins to happen because of the extremity of the events and the climate catastrophes and the mass death that will come if we have high heat and high humidity in combination anywhere in the world. I mean, one of the highest wet bulb temperatures ever recorded was outside of Chicago. But it's basically a problem of the tropics. And when those heat death events begin to happen, then there are going to be people very angry who want not just justice but revenge. And there you get into much trickier ground than rational action. Oh, we need to create violence in order, essentially as a terrorism, to scare the powers that be into changing their ways. There will just be a desire to take revenge for crimes against humanity and against individual villages. If everybody dies in your village, you're going to be angry. And the world will get more violent in a climate change scenario. Now, can you turn it to use? Here I would say my novel is not very clear or useful as a teaching device. At that time, I had not read Andreas Malm's How to Blow Up a Pipeline, and there's a distinction, and you're trying to help me here in that the damage in Ministry for the Future is mostly against property, semi-true, semi-not. There's a lot of targeted murders described in the Ministry for the Future, acts of terrorism or murder. And we don't know who the children of Kali are, and we don't know how much Mary's assistant, Badim, who is head of what you might call the black wing of the Ministry for the Future, we don't know what he has authorized. The novel doesn't tell the reader. The reader has to be put in the position of Badim. What would you authorize if you were charged with trying to save the climate of the biosphere, or charged with trying to save the biosphere by targeting? I mean, it's estimated that there's maybe 100 big corporations that are responsible for more than 70% of the fossil fuel emissions. So are these criminals in some kind of world historical sense that should be in jail or should be stopped? Well, what Malm made clear that my novel doesn't make clear is that there's a distinction to be made between sabotage and murder. There's fundamental, that sabotage should be happening all the time if this equipment is wrecking the earth, that murder should never happen, as being unjustifiable and leading to horrible backlashes and being simply something one shouldn't try to justify in any situation whatsoever. So sabotage, yes, murder, no. I mean, you can read Ministry for the Future with this generous eye, but the novel is messier than that. And luckily, history itself is very, very messy and does not make clear moral distinctions. So I don't feel like it lessens the novel as a novel, as a work of art representing reality. As a teaching device, yes, it's not a great teaching device.
Okay. You mentioned that you were writing it in 2019, which is, Lord save us before lockdown. Many of us feel we entered another chapter of our lives personally in 2020. Is there anything else in the situation about the climate crisis or how things are playing out politically that has changed since you were writing the novel, which you would maybe adjust now if you were doing a second edition?
Well, strangely, it seems like I caught the important aspects of things. Remember, I wrote it during a Trump administration. So I wrote it, I was very angry at the self-regard and the provincial stupidity of Trump and the Republican Party, and therefore of the Americans that got him elected. So I was angry, and I wrote the book in anger, and so now it still seems perfectly in vibe with our current moment. And the problems were out there then. They still are the same problems. 6 years further on, there's been, I would say, an increase of the dangers, but also a rapid increase in the solutions being rolled out, as I described before. So it's like more of everything, but only 6 years more of everything. And this is a process that's going to take another half century to a century to see how we did. Looking back on the 21st century, I mean, this is a kind of crux moment, but every year for the next 20 years is going to be a crux moment in terms of casting a trajectory of climate results and of biosphere loss. It will be more or less. And so I like this phrase from Robert Koff: every ton counts. Every ton of CO2 we cast into the atmosphere is going to exacerbate our problems. And every ton that we pull back down into the ground is going to help our problems. So it isn't an either or. It's simply a fight for better or worse.
You have a number of cornerstones in the novel. Is there any other things that you think we should be doing now to work our way towards the solutions, plural?
Well, there were a couple of things mentioned in ministry that don't get played out, but they are important. An understanding that government is driving these processes because it sets the laws and it makes the money and it protects civilization with armies and police, that state solutions are important. Therefore, progressive taxation. This is simply Keynesianism and a kind of liberal response to the problem of being trapped in capitalism. You can't just wave your hand and do like the Wizard of Oz and say, now we are all living in a communal and intelligent civilization or a better utopian civilization. No, we're stuck in what we're stuck in. So what can we use are the tools that have been used before. If there was a progressive taxation on both income and on assets, companies would immediately get smaller to dodge taxes that would, if they were set smartly, they would encourage diversity and they would create more equality. So one of the big drivers of the climate crisis and the biosphere crisis is intense inequality amongst humans. And you know this more than most people because of the life that you've lived. This planet is ridiculously unequal and unjust when it comes to human terms. And that is not a trivial or something that you could say, well, we'll solve the climate crisis first and then we'll solve the inequality problem. No, the two are one. One of the things that we're not doing is telling this story that intense massive wealth and the whole, what got called the 1% during the occupation years, they are a big source of the problem and they can be taxed out of existence by the ordinary force of legislation, law, and the armies backing up the laws. Well, people aren't telling this story enough. And it's because it's an actionable tale to tell. In other words, you could do it. You could write legislation. You could even, they're doing this in Taiwan, gather citizens groups, brainstorm these problems in the way that you just asked me, collect the Post-it note solutions, and usually that's the end of it, and these sessions are not particularly productive. But in Taiwan, what they do is they give it to an AI, and they say, please give us the 3 most popular solutions being discussed today in the form of legislation. And the AI can do that in 5 seconds instead of a month with a human bias in it. The Taiwan legislature has agreed to look at these as bills that have been proposed. So suddenly it's citizens as legislators, finally. Representation gets very generalized. And here is like almost the only useful thing I've ever heard about AI helping us with. It is a help. The rapid compilation and summarization of data fed into it is indeed remarkable in these large language models. In general, is somewhat useless, but if we can figure out the right ways to put it to use, it could speed up processes like representative democracy and like a more equal economic system, a political economy that gets legislated into being. That's not happening fast enough. It's not a big enough part of the conversation. People moan, they groan, oh my God, the rich and everything, and yet do not elect politicians that have the guts to go ahead and pass progressive taxation and the support, essentially creating social democracies as a first step to a more just civilization. That could be done. It's not being done enough.
Okay. I mean, I did see a really amazing infographic based on research interviewing Democrats and Republicans of the ideal distribution of income and wealth, and they were the same for Democrats and Republicans.
It's a good thought.
A challenging little question. COP. We're about to have another one. What would you change about COP? Would you keep it going? Would you root it in one city so it doesn't move around with all this expense? Maybe Nairobi, which is very popular, or what would you do with COP?
Well, it's interesting you ask, because I'm part of a UN working group that is trying to figure out these to answer this very question. And everybody in the room is more experienced in the ways of COP than I am, but I have some things I can bring to the table, which is maybe the idea of the future and of thinking outside the box of what's been done so far. But in terms of process at COP, they've got to get rid of this consensus model where every nation has to sign off. They got to go back to majority rule, where if a majority of the nations agree on something, a small rump party of recalcitrant fossil fuel petrostates cannot screw up the whole system and make COP glacially slow in the old sense of glacial. I admire COP. I think we do need to meet every year and talk about the climate crisis and what we can do about it as a civilization. It's a good spectacle. It's important. And I think moving around the world is not the problem, because it creates enormous excitement in the countries it comes to. What has to get changed is this consensus model. And here's the thing. The Paris Agreement is written such that it would take a consensus vote to get rid of the consensus model of voting. Now, that's going to be hard, and it's a matter of diplomacy over some years to get that change made. One thing that's been suggested about this is don't call it consensus, because, first of all, in English, that's a confusing word. It means 2 or 3 things, and it isn't clear which one you mean in this context. Talk about it as veto, because people don't like the idea that one small group can veto the action of a large majority. We got to get rid of this veto power of the petrostates in the COP system.
Okay. Thanks very much, Stan. That's what we've got time for, but I think we've covered we've scratched the surface about your book, and we've certainly only been able to scratch the surface of the climate change crisis, but thanks so much for talking to us.
Well, thank you, Geoff. It's been a pleasure, as always, and I look forward to seeing you in the UK next year.
Brilliant. And we're looking forward to seeing you here, too. Take care.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Bye.